welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. Happy New Year. Happy 2022. I hope thus far, as of recording, it's 7 days into it. I hope it's going well for you so far. I pre-record these shows. So if you're listening on the radio, I recorded this Friday. So it's the day before broadcast, the Saturday broadcast, and 2 days before the Sunday broadcast. Either way, welcome here. Quick plugs out of the way. GeekTherapyRadio.com is the best way to get in touch with me, or you can just email me directly, Johnny@GeekTherapyRadio.com. That's JOHNNY. But yeah, on geektherapyradio.com, the first thing you see is a contact field. It does not sign you up for any mailing list. I've said this ad nauseum in past shows. It doesn't sign you up for anything. It's just literally a way to message me directly. So feel free to reach out to me there. You can grab the podcast. This is for the radio listeners. You can grab the podcast in your favorite podcast app. So Spreaker, Spotify, of course, the iHeartRadio app, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, all that good stuff. Just search for Geek Therapy Radio Podcast. No matter where you're searching for Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, look for the red, white, and black color scheme. That includes YouTube as well. Speaking of YouTube, hopefully I'll be uploading this video to the YouTube channel. I don't see why I wouldn't. This is pretty straightforward broadcast video recording here. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see in the corner here of the screen, side of the screen, I've got a CRT hooked up to my recording computer here in the solar-powered Geek Therapy Radio Studios. I'm going to be displaying some, I call it Geekin' tabs. It's kind of the tabs that I've had opened over the past week or so in between shows, kind of shows you what I've been researching. And so if you watch the YouTube video version of this, you'll see it up here on the CRT. We'll see if I do any closer zoom-ins to see what I'm talking about, but we'll see. The idea of this on YouTube, just so to let you know, listeners and podcast listeners of a broadcast like this that I'm uploading, it's not necessarily for you to keep the tab open and watching for 39 straight minutes. It's kind of more designed to open the tab and have it kind of going in the background while you do other stuff on the computer, while you game or whatever. And then when I'm talking about something that might sound interesting to you, sure, you can click over on the tab and see if I'm showing pictures of it or displaying it in some sort of way. But the podcast upload to YouTube is just very relaxed. And I even put in the title there that it is a podcast, so not to get people's hopes up that like it's a super in-depth like review of something, but it's much more easygoing. It's good content to provide. Speaking of content to provide, I uploaded an ASMR style video yesterday about replacing the lithium ion or lithium polymer batteries in your kind of common devices. And if you're watching the YouTube video right now, I'm holding up the device that I changed the lithium polymer battery in, one of my Bluetooth game controllers. This is an 8-bit DOE NES 30. They've discontinued it for a while now, but I showed on YouTube an ASMR style version of changing and kind of desoldering the battery out of there. Most of the time you don't have to desolder batteries out of these kind of common devices, but I did in this case. So you can go check out the YouTube channel and see that and a lot of other stuff. So speaking of other stuff, I've recorded several shows. It's kind of out of frame here with my RCA 77DX vintage ribbon microphone that has been in my family since brand new in 1954. Let's see if I can maybe swivel it out a little bit. Which way is this arm bending? Forgive me, it's live radio. No, I don't want to do that because it looks like it's going to come off the desk. If there's a crash of a 60-something-year-old microphone in the background, that's because I fiddled with it while I was recording. Anyways, I did a video about that. That's up on the YouTube channel as well. Briefly, that's the microphone. If you remember David Letterman and talk shows and Johnny Carson and all that kind of stuff and Larry King, that's the microphone that was sitting on their desk. It's a capsule-looking, Tylenol-looking microphone. Very interesting video there. And speaking of YouTube and cameras and videos, that was kind of one of the main points I wanted to bring up in this segment, which I think it's going to boil over into the next segment here. But as you know, I work for the Houston Museum of Natural Science. I'm the YouTube channel manager over there, and I have pushed my current camera to its limits. So you're looking at the camera right now. It is a Canon SL3, known as the Canon SL3, EOS SL3 here in the United States. In other countries and other regions, it's known as the Canon 250D, and it is a spec spectacular camera for the price. I think it's between $500 and $700, something like that. I sold a car so that I could buy this camera back when I worked full-time at iHeart, and then the museum noticed the videos I was putting out with this camera and hired me on, and it made my life better. So this camera is a great camera, but as content creation and video production has become my day-to-day job, I have finally reached that point where I understand the limitations of this camera, and I understand the difference between this camera and an actual professional cinema camera, and I want to talk about that. That's kind of a good segue eventually into the gear discussion. There's this kind of back and forth, and I've talked about it a time or two on the show, where I think especially beginners and newbies get into a craft and they think they have to buy a $5,000 camera or a $5,000 microphone. They think that's going to make them sound better and be better, when it's the furthest thing from the truth. If you dive in head first into professional gear, you're going to be discouraged. You're not going to know what you're doing with it. It's actually going to reveal how untalented you really are thus far. And I mean that in the most loving way possible. It's like high definition revealing, wow, you got a lot of wrinkles on your face. So anyways, let's talk about all that. Let's talk about the camera that I'm thinking about getting. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up in the next segment. It's going to be a good show. Stick around. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. If you listen to the radio, you just heard several minutes of commercials. If you're listening to the podcast, I don't think there's any commercials in this first break, so you didn't hear any. And if you're watching YouTube, there were no commercials at all, just a nice kind of smooth transition. So if you're listening on the radio, I got to think about this now. When I record these for video, for YouTube, and for podcast, and for radio, I'm recording to 3 different outlets, so I have to think about how I'm introducing segments, how I'm exiting segments, how I describe what I'm talking about for the radio listener, how I describe what I'm talking about for the podcast listener, and how I show what I'm talking about, to some degree at least, for the YouTube viewer. So, welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. For those listening to the broadcast, geektherapyradio.com, Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, in your favorite podcast app. Just look for the red, white, and black color scheme everywhere, and that's how you know you've got me. All right, so I ended the last segment discussing my really need at this point to step up my video production gear, since that has been for the last year or so coming up my job for the Houston Museum of Natural Science as the YouTube channel manager over there. We have an awesome videographer. His name is John Danielson. Bewildering cinematographer. The content that he produces for our YouTube channel, you can definitely tell when it's a John production, because he has been doing video editing and cinematography long before I have, and he's got like the cameras that he has. I'm not going to give a price on here, but I'll give just a couple of the cameras that he's used on shoots that we've done. Sony FX6, Sony FX9. If you go and look up the value of those cameras, you'll see that they are very much professional cameras. They are the cameras used to produce TV commercials, TV shows, movies, and films. He's got professional production cameras. And partly in working with him, I've realized just the gap between his cameras costing more than the car I drive and my $500 Canon here. So, like I said in the previous segment, this $500 Canon SL3 or 250D, depending what region of the world you're in, is a fantastic camera. I've loved it. But I've learned partly in working with him, like, there's things this camera can't do that I want it to do. And I've reached that point in my gear collecting, I guess, where now I understand the limitations of my equipment, and now it's a good natural step a good natural point to step up to more professional equipment. And I think that's a good kind of anecdote for anybody who has gear lust. So you've been working with something for a little bit amount of time, or you haven't, you're a complete noob and you think you need this new piece of gear, but you need to ask, and I'll just kind of fast forward to the point here. Ask yourself if you know how to use those functions. Like at the new gear that you own, that you're going to grab, do you know how to get the most out of it now? Have you grown out of your old gear enough to recognize what you need exactly in this new gear? So for instance, I'll go back to my camera search, and I'll show it over here in the computer in a minute. I'll bring it up actually while I'm talking about it. I've been looking at the, this is such a long name, Blackmagic Design Cinema Pocket 6K Pro. I've got it up on the CRT monitor here. It shoots in 6K all the way up to 50 or 60 frames per second, 4K at 60 frames per second, 1080p at 120 frames per second. So it's a high frame rate. There is just a gargantuan amount of features in this camera that are different from this kind of consumer DSLR that I've been using for the past year and a half, 2 years. But I know I've reached that limit. And so one in particular, this is a very basic thing, and this is it's not a review for the Pocket 6K Pro because I don't have it yet. One of the areas I've realized that I'm lacking in this SL3, in this $500 camera, first and foremost, are ND filters. Now, neutral density filters. In brief, what they do is they limit the amount of light coming in to hit the sensor so that you can make appropriate adjustments to your shutter speed and your ISO, so that you can keep your depth of field, so that you can keep the natural motion blur in the picture. So you use an ND filter when you need to keep it at 24 frames a second, you need to keep the ISO at 100, and you need to keep the shutter speed at 1/48th. Gosh, I'm just blanking out. You know what I'm talking about. You need to keep those settings. And so if you're out in a bright light, you might need to adjust settings to, you might need to adjust ISO lower, you might need to adjust certainly the shutter speed faster to limit the amount of light coming in. You might need to limit the aperture, so your f-stops. So right now I'm recording this at f4.0 because that's the lowest that this lens can currently go. If you're outside, you might need to raise that f-stop to like f22, which means that you're going to lose this blur behind you, which means you're going to lose the natural motion blur too in the picture once you start getting the shutter speed. And I know it's a whole bunch of jargon, and that's kind of the point. If you're not into video, if you have no clue what I'm talking about, it doesn't matter. You're getting the point here. This camera doesn't have built-in ND filters, so I'd have to be screwing things to the lens to reduce the amount of light coming in. It's kind of a pain in the butt. I don't have ND filters to fit this specific lens right here, but the Blackmagic Design Pocket Cinema 6K Pro, what a ridiculously long name. One of the reasons I want this camera is that it has built-in ND filters. I'll show you an example of that. I'll show you an example of the button here on a camera, on a professional camera. So this is the camera I've talked about in the past on the show. This is the Panasonic DVX100B. I wanted this camera because this is what they've shot the first 5 seasons of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with, one of my favorite TV shows. And the camera's been out since like 02 or 03. I think this version, the 100B, has been out since 04 or 05. It's what they use on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, but it has built-in ND filters. Let me see if I can get closer to the camera here, if it'll focus on it. Let's see here. And what you do is you flick this switch, and it basically makes the image darker or lighter based on your conditions, so that you can keep the aperture settings you need, so that you can keep the shutter speed that you need, so that you can keep the ISO that you need, so you can keep those kind of nice and silky images on the screen. And that's one reason why I want this I'm just going to call it the 6K Pro for now. is it has those built-in ND filters, which are a godsend to cinematography out in the field. Some of the other features a cinema camera has over just a normal DSLR that I'm using right now to film this with is your oh gosh, I'm blanking out. I'm treating this as live radio. Your dynamic range. Sorry about that. This has up to 13 stops of dynamic range, whereas I don't even know what the dynamic range of this camera, the Canon 250D, I don't imagine it's very much. It's probably 8 or 9 stops if I'm thinking off the top of my head. Probably. I don't see how it could be much more than that. It might be less than that. Dynamic range, basically, the difference between a cinema camera like this one and the one I'm using right now is how much detail you can keep within the shadows and the highlights before overexposure. So if I raised, I'll show you on the video here, if I raised my exposure too high here, you'll see things start getting blown out. It's really washed out. You can't see details in my skin because it's blown out. It's all just white. That's part of the dynamic range. You'll see that if I go back down to the ISO where I was at. I forget where I was. Does that look good? Is this where I was at? That looks pretty good. Now you can see more detail in my face. It's not overblown, but you're losing some details kind of like in the shadows around me, or you can. I'm going to have to finish this up in the next segment. The dynamic range has to do with how much detail you can see in the highlights and how much detail you can see in the shadows. And that is a huge impact on image quality. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, geektherapyradio.com, and you can find, that's the best way to contact me, and you can find Geek Therapy Radio podcast and YouTube just by searching for Geek Therapy Radio podcast. Well, no matter what you're looking for, no matter what podcast app you're looking on, Spotify, Spreaker, iHeartRadio app, whatever, just look for the red, white, and black color scheme. So type in Geek Therapy Radio podcast, look for the red, white, and black color scheme. As you can see on, can I minimize this? As you can see on my monitor over here, that's the color scheme, the CRT I have going on in the background here of this recording. On YouTube, that you can watch on YouTube. So if you're searching on YouTube also, look for the red, white, and black color scheme when you type in Geek Therapy Radio. So we were talking about kind of the differences between DSLR, like a $500 DSLR, which is what I'm using right now to record this the video version of this broadcast and podcast with, which you can find on YouTube. The difference between that, like a $500 consumer, prosumerish DSLR, and a much more expensive dedicated cinema camera. This camera, by the way, what I'm talking about at the moment specifically is the Blackmagic design. I'm just going to call it Pocket Cinema 6K Pro. Very long title. One of the differences here between the $500 and $600 camera is the image quality. So when you're watching a TV or a movie, you're watching a Marvel movie, or you're watching Spider-Man No Way Home, or you're watching Mandalorian or whatever, and you're kind of thinking, man, why does this look, what is it about this image that is noticeably different? Like there's a different quality to it, if you kind of follow me. Why does this look the way that it does versus my, iPhone 13 or my Samsung Note 20 or S20 Plus or whatever? Like, they're really good cameras in these smartphones. The cameras in these smartphones are spectacular. And even the iPhones now brag that they have professional cinema grade, cameras in their phones, which is arguable. Even the best cameras in smartphones can't touch the image quality coming out of $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, $50,000, $100,000 cinema cameras. The camera I'm looking at, by the way, brand new, is $2,500, which is a market disruptor, price for a dedicated cinema camera that holds its own against cameras costing 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times as much money. But when you're looking at my son screaming he's playing downstairs, Riker. But one of the differences between when you're looking at a cinema production, like I said, The Mandalorian and whatever movie you're looking at, TV commercials, and then you're kind of thinking about what's coming out of your $500 DSLR or your smartphone. I almost called it a cell phone, like a grandpa, coming out of your smartphone. Part of it is the dynamic range that I talked about. The other part is the sensor size. The actual physical sensor inside here can collect so much more light and data from the lens, from an image, than your smartphone certainly can, and then a DSLR can. Think about the image sensor inside your smartphone. It's almost microscopic. It's not microscopic, but I don't know, a few millimeters in size, versus the image sensor in here is almost an inch, if not a little bit bigger. This is a Super 35 sensor, so it's kind of a crop sensor. It's not a full frame sensor technically, but the sensor inside, it's like this. Here's a good example of it. So I'm holding this flash card. Let's see if I can focus on it. It's an old flash card that I like to use in my retro PC builds. This is like the image sensor that's built in, this roughly the size of the image sensor, more or less, as far as relatively speaking, is inside of a cinema camera. And I don't know if I have something small enough to show up on a camera that will represent the sensor size inside your smartphone. But here's a mini SD. That's kind of what we're talking about here, except picture this mini SD card, micro SD card, many times smaller. So small that you probably wouldn't even be able to see it in the frame here. That's the difference between a pro cinema camera and your smartphone. And a DSLR will be somewhere kind of in between. Here's a normal sized SD card. So bigger sensor, more data you can collect. The better the image quality is, the more dynamic range you have, the more details you can see in the shadows and the highlights. That all adds up to the difference in image quality between a DSLR smartphone and a cinema camera. And that's one of the reasons why I want this dedicated cinema camera. That and all the more control I have over the image. Another thing that differentiates the cinema camera from a normal DSLR and most smartphones, because I think the iPhone now can shoot in ProRes, which is why they call it a pro grade cinema camera, because it can shoot in ProRes. I'll explain what that is briefly. ProRes is a codec, a container, if you will, of a video file that basically I think ProRes compresses a little bit of the image, a little bit if I'm not mistaken, but it's more of a raw format. It takes up so much data on your phone, or so much data on a memory storage device to shoot in a raw format. You're talking, so in this 6K camera that I want, when I'm shooting in Blackmagic RAW at 3:1, it's consuming, at 30 frames a second, it's consuming something like 350 or so, over 300 megabytes. Is it megabytes per second? I think it's megabytes or megabits per second of video, versus on your phone or on your DSLR. I think this Canon is shooting at something like 15 or maybe 25 megabits per second, versus literally 10 times as much, if not more, on a professional cinema camera. And that's capturing so much more data from each image, which means that I can go back in my image editing or my video editing software, which I like to use Blackmagic Design DaVinci Resolve, which is another reason why I want this camera, because the workflow, staying in the Blackmagic ecosystem, makes everything so much better. But shooting in that raw format with all that data means I can manipulate the image 1,000 times better than I can manipulate the image coming out of my phone or the image coming out of this DSLR camera, which only shoots to a very compressed MP4 codec. It's like the difference between an MP3 and a WAV file. It's the difference between an MP3 at like 128 kilobits per second, 16-bit, and listening to a lossless 24-bit, 192 kilohertz wave file. It's that much difference. You have much more editing capability to manipulate the bigger file, the 24-bit 192 versus the 16-bit 128 kilobits per second MP3. It's just kind of the same idea when you're editing video. So if I'm shooting with this camera, the 6K Pro here in Blackmagic RAW, or B-RAW for short, I know we're getting technical here. Thank you for sticking with me. If I'm shooting in B-RAW 3.1 6K, the files that I'm going to be editing are going to be in the tens or dozens of gigabytes in size. You're not just going to pull a file like off of your DSLR here, or off your phone that's like a gig. I'm pulling files off here that could be 100 gigs in size. It is a massive amount of data to actually have to store in a storage medium. But once I'm editing with that file, all that extra data means I can manipulate the image much more cleanly, much more precisely, and with much greater detail and depth than I possibly could shooting with my $500 Canon here, or certainly off of my phone. So with my Canon here, the $500 Canon doesn't shoot in any sort of RAW format. So the best I can do to help give me the most room and headroom to manipulate the image is to shoot in a very flat profile. If you're watching on YouTube, I will put an unedited clip in here, unedited image clip in here of the format, the flat profile I'm shooting in, and then I'll go back to my edited footage where I've color graded it to the best of my ability. To the best of the ability, you can color grade a RAW, like Blackmagic B-RAW. You can color grade a RAW codec with all that extra info so much better and so much more precisely than I can possibly color grading this compressed file coming out of my DSLR camera here. For one thing, DSLRs, they're designed to shoot pictures first. So I can shoot raw files of still images. I can shoot, what is it, Canon RAW or C-RAW coming out of here? I'm not a photo editor, but it's the same principle. I have it set to shoot dual files, so it shoots the RAW, but it also creates a JPEG, a super compressed JPEG out of here that really can't be edited very much, not like a RAW file can, but it's the same principle. So these cameras, the DSLRs, are designed to shoot photos first, and then it's kind of like an extra that you can shoot footage on here, that you can shoot videos on here. With the Pro Cinema camera, I just burped. With the Pro Cinema camera, it is always videography first. It's always video first, film first. That is what it's focused on. That's what all its abilities cater to. And then there's like a small stills button that you're supposed to shoot a still of an image to send to your director or something like that. Anyways, more Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Back to Geek Therapy Radio. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger. That's all I'm going to say about my kind of current camera situation, camera desires, if you can call it that, and it certainly is. I talked at length, and if you can tell, I know there's listeners out there who are professional photographers, who are professional cinematographers, professional videographers, who can hear exactly the point I'm at in my cinematography professionalism. Like, I'm right. You can tell by the way I was struggling to describe what shutter speed was that I'm right there on my journey. Like, I'm at this precipice of going pro, and that's kind of what I've been talking about. I'm at that precipice, so now I'm at enough of impasse to understand that this Canon camera that I'm shooting with is getting in the way of some things I want to do, namely ND filters, control over shutter, control over what codecs I'm recording in. I can't record RAW. I can't color grade as great with the camera that I'm using. 6K, one of the things I told the museum, and I'll move on to other subjects, hopefully, in this last segment. One of the things I told the museum when I was hired is I want to get up to uploading 4K content as much as possible. And I certainly cannot do that with the camera that I have right now. Sorry, I keep bumping the microphone. I can't upload 4K content technically with this camera right now. It can shoot at 4K 24 frames a second with crappy autofocus and crappy image stabilization, and it cuts way in, crops way in. It's 4K just so that they can say on the package, yeah, it shoots 4K. But it's not great 4K. So, Johnny, what about the 6K camera? That's more than 4K. Well, exactly. I can shoot in 6K here with the Pocket Cinema Pro, so that I can crop in. I can like zoom in on my face or zoom in on my nose or whatever. And when it's zoomed out, it's 6K. When it's zoomed in, it's 4K. So I can zoom in and punch into the image without losing any image quality. And let's say that I zoom way in, like I zoomed way in, like up my nose, then it'd still be at 1080p quality. And if I zoomed in further than that, it'd be at 720p. So if you start at 6K, not only do you just have all that information to work with, all that sensor data to work with, but now I can zoom in and crop into different scenes without losing image quality. When I zoom in, then I'm at 4K, and you're seeing a 4K image. If I zoom in further, like I said, you're seeing a 1080p image. So that's what 6K allows me to do, and that means when I shoot with this camera, I can upload content to not only my channel here, but definitely the museums, because that's where I do most of my work. I can start uploading in 4K. Not only just in 4K, but I can shoot high frame rate 4K, so I can do nice silky slow motion shots and B-roll in 4K and in 6K for that matter with this camera. Like I mentioned, to kind of wrap up my process, and I only skim the surface, like scratch the surface with what this camera will allow me to do. To wrap it up here, the cost, like I said, around $2,500. I saw it used once for $2,000, and I should have probably moved on it. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. But when you consider the next alternative from this is like $5,000. When you consider stepping up, I think the FX9 is like $11,000 or $12,000. The Sony. And the image quality is comparable. So, in conclusion about this, the last point I'm going to make is that this Blackmagic 6K Pro uses the Canon EF lens mount. So the lens I'm using on this camera is an EF lens, and I have 2 or 3 more EF lenses already. You can, am I pointing to them up here? Yeah, somewhere around there. I have 2 more EF mount lenses. I already have lenses for this camera. I don't have to go out. Like if I switch to Sony or if I switch to Nikon or Panasonic or something like that, y'all know who do cinematography and photographers that the cost of the body of the camera is one thing. You can spend tens of thousands of dollars on a single lens for a camera. I certainly don't have any lenses of that cost. But I have a nifty 50mm lens over here, and I have a 24mm lens. The 24mm lens going on this EF mount, since it's an EF lens, I have all the lenses already that I need to get started with. The 24mm lens will snap into the 6K Pro, and compensating for the crop of the Super 35 sensor, that'll give me a good, roughly 50mm equivalent crop or viewing angle, which is more natural to the eye. That's kind of what your eye naturally kind of sees, in between like 35 and 50mm compared to a camera kind of thing. Point is that getting the body of this camera means I already have everything I need here. I've got the lens that's on this camera, this Canon. I've got the 2 lenses up there. I've got DaVinci Resolve, which is what I already use. Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve is what I use to edit all my videos. So this is the most cost-effective way to get into a pro cinema camera, because I have outgrown my Canon DSLR here. I'm still going to use the Canon DSLR though, this 250D/SL3, EOS SL3. I'm still going to use it as a B cam. It's still going to be in the bag at all times for for shoots that I do, to have an extra camera around to get extra shots, because it still produces, even though I can't shoot RAW with it, a very good image quality for how much it costs. And I already have the lenses for it. So while the 6K is using the nifty 50 or the 24 millimeter, I can put the other one on this camera and have both cameras shooting on the EF mount. It's just going to up my game. It's just going to mean that when I go into to shoot things or make content, I don't have to say, I would like to do that, but I can't, because I'm limited with the camera that I have, or I'm limited with the equipment that I have. This will allow me to do my job better. This may sound to the more keen of you that I'm making a pitch to my wife, who listens to the podcast, because I do want to purchase this camera out of pocket. I don't want to involve budgeting committees or anything like that with any job that I have. I want this to be mine, because there's things I want to do with it for church, for instance. There's things I want to do with it for my Geek Therapy Radio YouTube channel, and I don't want any sort of conflict of interest. And I don't want to go borrowing things out of our, camera locker at the museum. I just want to have my thing ready to go at all times. And I think it will be a good investment. Well, I definitely know it'll be a good investment, but like I said, $2,500, that is not anything to sneeze at. There's people listening right now. I remember my first car didn't cost anywhere near $2,500. My first 1974 Beetle, I think my dad paid $900 for it. It's just crazy that as we advance in our career, I'm looking at things to help my career along that are like, help me remember how far that I've come. Help me remember how far that we've come. Sitting in an apartment in the Woodlands, Texas, for some reason, looking at my cat's food because I knew it was the most tasty thing in the apartment. Looking into my pantry and not even having rice. Maybe having a few kernels of rice kind of sitting there on the shelf. Fast forward. Now I'm looking at the real possibility of getting a $2,500 camera to help my career along. And I've got a son. I've got a lot to be thankful for. That's what I'm thinking about going into 2022. Anyways, thank you for listening to Geek Therapy Radio broadcast and podcast and YouTube video. You are worthy of love. You're worthy of giving love, receiving love, and you're worthy of your own self-respect. Thank you so much for listening. Talk to you later. Peace. If you'd like to sponsor Geek Therapy Radio, just go to geektherapyradio.com and let's talk.